Welcome, viewers, to this latest podcast of the Nationalist View. And today we have with us again a very special guest, Dr. Michael Rubin. Dr. Rubin, thank you so much for
Thanks
taking.
for having me, Arun.
Yeah, and Dr. Rubin has taken time out from his busy schedule, and today we are going to talk about the Kurdish movement in Turkey, especially in context of the recent visit of Turkish President Erdogan in Pakistan, where he took a stand which is not very comfortable for India, and he has consistently been basically targeting India, especially on the Kashmir issue, but we'll look at the Kurdish movement within Turkey in context of the overall global geopolitics as well as with a little bit of Indian perspective also. Dr. Rubin recently wrote a very interesting article in First Post. We will be sharing the link of that article. He also wrote a piece in Middle East Forum also recently, and he has been consistently writing on the Turkey and other Middle East issues. And let me give a brief introduction of Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He is also policy director at Middle East Forum, and he's a former Pentagon official. Dr. Rubin has lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and both pre and post-war Iraq. He also spent time with Taliban before 9 by 11. For more than a decade, he taught classes at sea about the Horn of Africa and Middle East conflicts, culture, and terrorism to deployed US Navy and Marine units. Dr. Rubin has authored, co-authored, and co-edited a number of books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shiite politics. Some of his seminal works include Seven Pillars: What Really Causes Instability in the Middle East, Kurdistan Rising, Dancing with Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes, and Eternal Iran, Continuity and Chaos. Dr. Rubin has a PhD and an MA in history from Yale University. So, Dr. Rubin, my first question is that if you can provide an overview of the Kurdish movement in Turkey, Turkey's current strategies to deal with it, and how the Western world is looking at it.
Well, look, the core of the Kurdish movement in Turkey is the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Now, that said, there are many Kurds inside Turkey who don't belong to that movement, and the Turks will often point this out. For example, the second president of Turkey, İsmet İnönü, who took over when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk died, was actually Kurdish. But the issue here is that when Turkey points to Kurds, for example, İsmet İnönü, or perhaps even Turgut Özal, these are people who may have been ethnically Kurdish, but didn't embrace Kurdish identity. And so while Turkey says, hey, this shows that we can all be citizens, in reality, what it shows is you can only be citizens if you refuse to speak Kurdish, if you refuse to dance Kurdish, if you refuse to eat Kurdish food or use certain letters of the alphabet that exist in Kurdish, but not in Turkish. And so this is why when we say the PKK seems to be the best known or most popular Kurdish movement in Turkey, that's why we say that. Now, to be fair, look, the PKK started back in the 1980s. 1984, it was formally declared by Abdullah Öcalan. Now, Abdullah Öcalan was a militant leftist. And at the time, I mean, in the 1970s, for example, and early 1980s, there was a bifurcation in Kurdish society between those who were very conservative and those who were very left-wing. And Öcalan belonged to the very left-wing. And it was common to have street brawls. There was instability. This is why there was a coup in 1980 to try to repair some of the damage and to reset Turkey on the tracks. What happened and what makes Öcalan different is that Öcalan at one point basically said, you know, it's one thing to be leftist, but I don't want to be a leftist Turk. I want to be a leftist Kurd. And so this is what he did in effect was fracture the hard left movement inside Turkey to make a Kurdish nationalist movement. And then what he did, and this is where he's open to criticism, he targeted a lot of his potential rivals. So the first victims of the PKK were actually fellow Kurds. Regardless, that's more than 40 years ago now. And the fact is, he has evolved, the PKK has evolved, and he is indisputably the most influential figure, A, among the Kurds in Turkey, but also among the Kurds in Syria, Iran, and increasingly inside Iraq as well, simply because the last point I'll make is that the PKK is much more of an ideological movement, a philosophical movement, whereas inside Iraqi Kurdistan, the major Kurdish parties are tribal movements, they're family movements. The Kurdistan Democratic Party is associated with Masoud Barzani. His son, Masroor Barzani, is the prime minister and the head of the security forces. And Masroor Barzani's son, Arun Barzani, is already being groomed for power. The same thing we have with the rival Kurds, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is associated with the Talabani family. And so if you're an ordinary Kurd, if you've been studying hard, if you can't find a job because someone who's a Barzani or a Talabani keeps getting that job ahead of you, you become attracted to this other movement, which doesn't embrace tribalism, which embraces much more meritocracy and so forth. And that's why we see the gravitation of people to the PKK. And they also, it's not just theory anymore. They have an ability to show you what they can do. And that's what the Kurdish entity in northeastern Syria was. It's not run by the PKK, but it's run according to Abdullah Öcalan's philosophy. And even though it's not materially as rich as Iraqi Kurdistan, because it doesn't have the same amount of oil, the fact is it's far more successive. It's far more successive, and it's far more inclusive, progressive, and tolerant, democratic.
How do you look at the implication of Abdullah Öcalan's recent call for the PKK to disarm and dissolve? Because you wrote about it also in an article. What are its implications, or how do you look at it? Is it a call which he has given under duress, or is there something else?
Well, a lot of people, look, it's a great question, Arun, because Abdullah Öcalan has been in prison since 1999, so for more than a quarter of a century, and not only in prison, he's been in prison on an island where he is the only prisoner. So he's been in isolation. It's rare that even his lawyers get to see him. So he hasn't had direct command and control of the PKK for so long, for some time. Now he's been able to write books and that sort of thing and read, basically transform himself into a political philosopher, but he hasn't had day-to-day control. And this is where I think President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey gets it wrong. He may think he can trot him out, perhaps under duress, perhaps just because after 25 years of isolation, it's possible to do these things. But the PKK, because of his arrest, Abdullah Öcalan's arrest in 1999, has had to diversify its leadership, has had to diversify its military, has had to come up with new systems. And so what we've basically seen are two responses. First of all, we have to vote on this, according to PKK members. And the second is, well, this is all well and good for Abdullah Öcalan to say this, but we are under fire right now from the Turks, and therefore we're not able to lay down our arms until the Turks lay down their arms. Now, when Abdullah Öcalan calls for a ceasefire, also, remember that there's been major ceasefires in 2012 and in 2015 as well. They all broke down. In the 2012 ceasefire, the idea was for the PKK to lay down its arms in Turkey and move to Syria, which they did. And then Turkey started attacking Syria. And so there's a great deal of cynicism among the PKK, among the Kurds, who say, look, we value Abdullah Öcalan as a founding father, but we don't necessarily take his commands. The other stream of thought, however, is the Kurds have long likened Abdullah Öcalan in prison on Imre Island to Nelson Mandela, who was imprisoned on Robben Island. And they both started out as terrorists. Radicals who conducted violence and so forth. They both had a change of heart when they were in prison. What's the difference? The difference is when Nelson Mandela came out of prison, P.W. Botha, the head of South Africa, ultimately resigned and allowed a transition. So it's very fair to ask in Turkey, A, are you going to let Abdullah Öcalan out of prison? And B, where is Erdogan's resignation? And just for the fun of it, C, where is the Truth and Reconciliation Committee so we can examine what has happened over the 20 years of Erdoganism?
Absolutely, absolutely right. And now we'll move towards a little bit to India's neighborhood. Uh, from an Indian strategic perspective, because especially you wrote about that, from an Indian strategic perspective, how does this Turkey-Pakistan bonhomie impact India's regional interests? And can supporting the Kurdish movement in Turkey mitigate those impacts? Can it be a kind of a counteroffensive in
The
diplomacy?
short answer is yes. Okay. The other thing to understand about Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he participated in the first Islamic party inside Turkey when he was mayor of Istanbul, and ultimately when Necmettin Erbakan's government collapsed, when people would say it was pushed out in a soft way by the military, although the European Court of Human Rights ultimately affirmed that what had happened was legal. Abdullah Öcalan went to prison briefly for religious incitement, came out, and he said he was a changed man. He was a pragmatist. And so when he came into power in 2023, his party actually came into power before, but because he had been in prison, he wasn't able to actually take office until they changed the laws. At any rate, when he became prime minister in 2003, people celebrated him as a pragmatist because they said he was a changed man. He could link democracy and Islamism. And to his credit, where a lot of the other Turkish parties had run Turkey's economy into the ground, Recep Tayyip Erdogan had actually paid attention to constituent services. And so he attracted to the Justice and Development Party by the Turkish acronyms, the AKP. Lots of people who weren't necessarily Islamists, who were businessmen, who were conservative, who had had enough with the old order. Now, what he was also able to take advantage of the demographic dividend. And so when he took office, the Turkish economy flew. Now, here's the issue. Recep Tayyip Erdogan once said, democracy is like a streetcar. You ride it as far as you need, and then you step off. And in the West, we were so naive, we forgot that he said this. We forgot he described himself as the Imam of Istanbul. We forgot that he described the Turkish army as the army of Muhammad, or that he also declared himself as a servant of Sharia. At any rate, once he was able to consolidate control, first over the economic sector, by taking over the tax technocrats, the banking technocrats, so he could close any businesses of rivals or punish those who spoke out against him. Once he was able to take almost authoritarian control over the mechanisms of government, then we saw his ideology come through. So this comes to your question, Arun. Erdogan at heart is an ideologue. He's a Muslim brother ideologue. He can't stand to see any Muslims live under non-Muslim rule. This is why we see him being so proactive in support for terrorism when it comes to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But it's also why we have always seen him engaged in Kashmir. And if he can do it through Pakistan, then he has a little bit of plausible deniability, but make no mistake. He has repeatedly met with Kashmiri militants. He's repeatedly met with Chechen militants in Russia and so forth. It's just part of his philosophical upbringing. No Muslims under non-Muslim rule. So he's like a dog with a bone. He's not going to drop Kashmir, and he's not going to drop the Kashmir issue, no matter how much diplomats want to appeal to him, or no matter how quiet he may become. Now, personally, I think we should be supporting the Kurds for their own merit. They are 40 million people spread largely across 4 countries, and they deserve a state. That said, if Erdogan as an ideologue, isn't going to give up on supporting Kashmir terrorists. Let's not call them militants, they're terrorists. At the same time, perhaps the pragmatist in him would realize, well, if the Indians are going to respond in kind by, for example, providing weaponry to the PKK, then maybe at the very least, we can just take a pause. We can have a hudna, we can have a temporary ceasefire. And me, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, I'll just focus elsewhere towards Gaza or towards Chechnya or towards Somalia or wherever. And so ultimately, I would say that India has to stop being polite. It's the world's largest democracy, the world's most populous country. Too often, it's also the world's least aggressive country when it comes to diplomatic strategy. It's time that India realized it's got to calibrate its strategy to its adversaries, to what its adversaries do to it. We've already seen Pakistan engages in cross-border actions using terrorists. So India actually responds directly with cross-border airstrikes, very justified airstrikes. And Pakistan gets the message. Turkey tries to support Kashmir terrorists. Well, India can support insurgents inside Turkey. And the fact is, that's the only way in which India is going to be successful. It can't defeat its enemies by being more polite than them.
But how is the West looking at Turkey, the rise of Turkey? We touched upon this a little bit in the last podcast also. And under Trump 2.0, especially because they seem to be more pragmatic, they are dealing with Russians also. Of course, that's another matter of discussion. And I read your very scathing piece on the recent developments which took place regarding the Ukrainian president. So, but anyway, how the West is looking at Turkey? Is there a containment policy, especially in Trump 2.0? And of course, Europe has a different kind of a viewpoint. Or are US and Europe on the same page when it comes to Turkey?
We're not sure whether the United States and Europe are on the same page because we're not exactly sure where Trump is actually going to fall with regard to Turkey. Trump, for example, seems to be very pro-Israel, although in Washington we're worried that perhaps Benjamin Netanyahu could be the next to get the Vladimir Zelensky treatment. But being pro-Israel, at least for now, Turkey has become Hamas's chief sponsor. So there is a conflict there. Now, Trump likes strongmen. And he doesn't mind autocrats. And so he's always gotten along with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Until at least Recep Tayyip Erdogan had taken an American pastor, Andrew Brunson, as a hostage during Trump his first term. And Trump tried to resolve this quietly. When it didn't work, Trump very loudly said he was willing to crash Turkey's economy. And he slapped sanctions on the steel industry in Turkey. The economy, the currency crashed, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan brought Andrew Brunson home. The point of this is that Turkey, we don't know where Trump is, but beyond Trump, there's Congress. And Congress has become very, very skeptical of Turkey because of Turkey's behavior over the decades. Now, Namık Tan, who was Turkey's foreign ministry spokesman, then he was Turkey's ambassador to Israel, and then he became Turkey's ambassador to the United States around 2010, once pointed to the Turkish caucus inside the US Congress, the affinity group, and it had more than 200 members, and he said, this is a metric of Turkey's influence in Washington. The fact that we have more than half of the US Congress signed on as affinity members to a strong Turkish-US relationship, that shows just how influential Turkey is. Well, if we look at the Turkish caucus in Congress today, it's actually less in number than the Algae caucus in Congress, those congressmen who are united in their desire to talk about policy about algae issues in the Gulf of Mexico, excuse me, the Gulf of America. At any rate, the fact of the matter is, this just shows how far Turkey's influence has dropped inside Washington. People despise Turkey. People recognize that Turkey is a terror sponsor. The debate in Congress isn't whether we should honor Recep Tayyip Erdogan. It's whether Turkey should be designated a state sponsor of terror. And so it is possible, if Trump tries to go too far in his embrace of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, for example, selling F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, then you would actually have Congress in a bipartisan manner make the relationship with Turkey to be the red line and say, no, we're taking this power out of your hands.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin, and we come to an end with this short, crispy, and hard-hitting podcast. And we'll be back soon with another program, another issue. And thank you so much once again, Dr. Rubin, for taking out time from your busy schedule. And if you want to share any questions with Dr. Rubin, you can post it in our YouTube comment box. And thank you, viewers, for watching. Thank you.
Thank you so much.